Number 10. Ball and chain. We've all heard the phrase, the old ball and chain, but how long ago was a ball and chain actually used as a punishment? Turns out, not that long. The ball and chain was used at Folsom Prison in California in the 19th century. Now, Folsom State Prison is California's second oldest prison, long known for its harsh conditions in the decades following the California gold rush. Now, these balls and or chains were a perfect example. It was cheap, it was efficient, and it was a pretty brutal punishment. You're not going anywhere. The old ball and chain was also used in Angola prison in Louisiana until fairly recent. Now, when you think about the fact that the Mississippi River is on 3 sides of that prison, a ball and chain feels like it would work 9 times out of 10. Unless you have the calves of Michael Phelps, you aren't swimming anywhere with one of these wrapped around your ankle. Number 9. Stranded outside. It turns out Judge Michael Ciccinetti has given out more than one unusual sentence. Why this judge gives out wacky sentences is beyond me, but here we are. In November 2005, Michelle Murray allegedly abandoned 35 kittens in 2 Ohio parks. Yeah, not 1, not 2, 35 kittens. That's horrible. Now, without going into detail, these kittens obviously didn't thrive after this point of abandonment. So the judge simply asked Michelle, how would you like to be dumped off at a metro park late at night, spend the night listening to coyotes and raccoons crawling around you in the dark, and sit out there in the cold, not knowing where you're going to get your next meal, and not knowing when you're going to be rescued? Yeah, pretty heavy question for a judge to ask you, pretty loaded. So Judge Ciccinetti brought the smoke. He told her that she has the choice of jail time, donating to the Humane Society, or spending 1 night alone in the woods. She chose the latter. She spent the night in the woods like she was camping. That sounds pretty terrifying, but it also sounds like she got off far too easy for what she did. She let 35 kittens go in the wild and she got to go camping? Okay, that's a bit not fair. Number 8. Solitary confinement. You're grounded for a while. Get down there. You're not coming back out. Solitary confinement is the act of isolating prisoners in a small cell with minimal human contact. It was used to reform and punish, only most of the time the prisoner went insane. Yeah, sorry about that, we forgot about you. Solitary confinement was introduced in the United States in the 1700s among religious groups. See, at first, they thought that isolation with a Bible in your hands, well, they thought that would lead to rehabilitation. It didn't, they just went mad with said Bible. The practice expanded significantly in the 19th century when it was viewed as a humane alternative to prevailing methods of punishment like public floggings. However, by the early 1900s, it had lost its charm due to its high cost and the fact that it was highly unethical. It would return as a common form of incarceration during the tough on crime political period in the 1980s and 90s, but otherwise you're not going to see this anymore. Thank the Lords. I thought being grounded was bad as a kid. This sounds brutal. Number 7. The drunkard's cloak. The drunkard's cloak was a form of punishment used in colonial America for public drunkenness, as you would have guessed. Offenders were made to wear a barrel with holes cut out for their head. I almost said heads and arms. They don't have 2 heads. With a barrel with holes cut out for their head and arms, making them a spectacle of public humiliation. Now, this punishment aimed to shame the individual and deter others from similar drunken behavior out and about. The last recorded use of the drunkard's cloak in America was in the early 19th century. Thank God this one's gone. That'd be pretty funny though. You walk down the street, someone wobbling, you're like, okay, he got a little crazy last night. Maybe a bachelor party? Who knows? There's 5 of them. They're all guilty. James
Joseph Whitty Bulger Jr. was an American organized crime boss who led the Winter Hill Gang in the Winter Hill neighborhood of Somerville, Massachusetts, a city directly northwestern of Boston. On December 23, 1994, Bulger fled the Boston area when he went to hiding after his former FBI handler, John Connolly, tipped him off about pending RICO indictment against him. Bulger remained at large for 16 years, and after 2011 arrest, federal prosecutors tried Bulger for 19 killings based on the grand jury testimony from Kevin Weeks and other former criminal associates. Although Bulger admittedly denied it, Bulger provided information of the inner workings of the Patriarca crime family and his Italian-American mafia rivals based on Boston and Providence, Rhode Island. In return, Connolly, as Bulger's FBI handler, ensured that the Winter Hill Gang was effectively or efficiently ignored. Beginning in 1997, press reports exposed various instances of criminal misconduct by federal, state, and local officials with ties to Bulger, causing embarrassment to several government agencies, especially to the FBI. Bulger's trial began in June 2013, and he was tried on 32 counts of racketeering, money laundering, extortion, and weapon charges, including complicity in 19 deaths. On August 12, Bulger was found guilty on all 31 counts, including both racketeering charges, and was found and involved in 11 killings. As a reward of US $2 million have been offered for information leading to his capture. At 8:20 a.m. on October 30th, 2018, the then 89-year-old passed away. Akoli was born on January 14, 1937 in Decatur, Texas, and was raised in Vernon, Texas. He then graduated from the Prairie A&M University in 1956 with a degree in mathematics in 19. And this guy was really smart. He was actually studying and becoming a computer analyst for NASA, working for Edwards Air Force Base in California. He then moved to New York City in 1963, becoming a civil rights movement activist before moving again in the summer of 1964 to Mississippi, continuing that new civil rights activism. Akoli was actually radicalized by the assassination of Martin Luther King in April 1968, and in that same year joined the Harlem chapter of the Black Panther movement, as well as its finance minister. He was arrested on April 2, 1969 as the Panther 21 conspiracy case, in which members were accused of planning, coordinating, killing a long-range rifle attack on 2 police stations and education offices in New York City. The group, called Computer People for Peace, raised $50,000 bail for him, but it was rejected by the judge. Akoli and other defendants were ultimately acquitted of all charges in this case, but his status, though, is still granted parole on May 10, 2022, but still currently serving a life sentence. Grant Chernin Amato is an American killer who was convicted of a family-side that occurred on the evening of January 24, 2019. Amato shot his parents and his brother Cody in the head in their home in Seminole, Florida, while attempting to stage it as a self-committed by his brother before fleeing the residence. He was captured after a 24-hour manhunt, put on trial, found guilty, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The reason? He was so into fanboying for online girl servers, so much to the point that he was addicted to their love and affection that he spent over $200,000 when he was already racking in so much debt and problems, lack of job, nor stability. His family was so desperate for him to get out of his obsession and addictions, they needed to get himself together or they were going to be cutting him off. And considering he was in deep into showing his online girlfriends so much love that he could afford it, to his family, to him, they also cut him off from his life, and so the nail in the head was taking Grant to rehab centers, and he couldn't take that. When he felt remorse, Amato responded with, "My family has been blaming me for months for ruining their lives, stealing and not following the rules of their home, so I might as well be blamed for this too." All for an online girlfriend. And finally, the nasty man for sure, a US Army non-commissioned officer named Clyde Lee Conrad, who from 1974 until his arrest on August 23, 1988, sold top secret classified information to the People's Republic of Hungary, including top secret NATO war plans. He was convicted for espionage and high treason in German court in 1990 and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Graduating from Sir Brigg McKinley High School in Sibrig, Ohio, he was a member of and letterman in both track and weaponry, and was also known as being quiet and a good student. According to court records, Conrad was introduced to the Hungarian Secret Service in 1975 by his supervisor in the 8th Infantry Division, former US Army Sergeant First Class Zoltan Zabau. Zabau, who was actually convicted in espionage in Austria in 1989, received a 10-month suspension sentence in exchange for assisting the investigation by identifying some of the documents Conrad sold to the Hungarians. It wasn't until he was convicted by the Koblenz State Court in June 6, 1990 of all charges and was sentenced to a life imprisonment and fined 2 million marks in order to forfeit all profits from his activities. He died of a heart attack though at age 50 in prison in 1998, and all the Americans convicted of espionage, Conrad is actually one of the only 5 spies to be considered making $1 million for just spying, which is pretty intense throughout all the stuff throughout history. And speaking of history, number 10, Bloody Monday. Although the Boomtown Rats wrote a song called I Hate Mondays based off of the killings of a 16-year-old girl named Brenda Ann Spencer, who targeted young students at an elementary school playground, which again another crime in the US that shocked many people, another Monday brought dark history but was forgotten as it was buried by other crimes and violence that echoed in the United States. Bloody Monday was a series of riots on August 6, 1855 in Louisville, Kentucky, and this was during an election day when Protestant mobs attacked Irish and German Catholic neighborhoods. These riots grew out of the bitter rivalry between the Democrats and the nativist Know Nothing Party. Multiple street fights raged, leaving 22 people dead, scores injured, and much property destroyed by fire. 5 people were later indicted, but none were actually convicted. The victims were not compensated. In this time, like other major cities on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, Louisville grew rapidly in the previously 2 decades because of heavy immigration from Ireland and Germany. By the time the violence ensued and the bloodshed was over, more than 100 businesses, private homes, and tenements had been vandalized, looted, and/or burned, including a block-long row of houses known as Quinn's Row. Historians estimated roughly the 22 people had died, but Catholics noted over 100, as there were also entire families who were consumed by the fires in their homes. Number 9, Rock Springs. Rock Springs sounds like a nice spa with self-care treatments, but when it comes to American history, we forgot to add the word massacre at the end of those 2 words. Yes, the Rock Spring Massacre is a reflection of the many discriminations and exclusions into results of violence of different ethnicities in the United States. The riot and resulting massacre of immigrant Chinese miners by white immigrant miners was the result of racial prejudice towards the Chinese miners who were perceived to be taking the jobs from the white miners. minors. The Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 suspended Chinese immigration for 10 years, but not before thousands of immigrants came to the American West. Most Chinese immigrants to Wyoming Territory took jobs at the railroad at first, but many ended up employed by the coal mines owned by the Union Pacific Railroad. As Chinese immigration increased, so did anti-Chinese sentiment on the parts of the whites, as anti-Chinese rhetoric and violence were more prevalent among the western chapters of the Knights, a group of white supremacy-focused order, and in 1880, San Francisco Knights wrote regarding the Chinese, "They bear the semblance of men but live like beasts who eats rice and the offal of the slaughterhouse," which as someone who loves rice, that's kinda rude. The article also calls Chinese natural thieves in quotes and stated that Chinese women are night walkers, if you get what I'm saying. However, this wouldn't be the first nor the last time of violence against the Chinese, which brings us to number 8. Number 8, the Los Angeles Chinese Massacre of 1871. The Los Angeles Chinese Massacre of 1871 was a racial massacre targeting Chinese immigrants in Los Angeles, California, United States, that occurred on October 24th, 1871. Approximately 500 white and Latino Americans attacked, harassed, robbed, and killed the ethnic Chinese residents in what is today referred to as Old Chinatown neighborhood. The mob gathered after hearing the policeman and a rancher had been killed as a result of a conflict between rival tongs, the Ninyang and Hongqiao, as news of their deaths spreads across the city, fueling rumors that the Chinese community were killing quote-unquote white wholesale. 19 Chinese immigrants were killed, 15 of them of whom were hung by the mob in the course of the riot. At least one was mutilated when a member of the mob cut off a finger and obtaining the victim's diamond ring. Those killed represented over 10% of the small Chinese population of Los Angeles at the time, which was numbered at 172 prior to the massacre. 10 men of the mob were prosecuted and 8 were convicted of manslaughter, and these convictions were overturned and appealed due to technicalities. Number 7, Hamburg Massacre. Of course, with the US, we must talk about another massacre, as it seems to be so prevalent on the land. During the Reconstruction era, there was an infamous riot known as the Hamburg Massacre or Red Shirt Massacre. Leading up to the last election season of the Reconstruction era, it was the first of a series of civil disturbances planned and carried out by white Democrats in the majority black Republican Edgefield district, with the goal of suppressing black American civil rights and voting rights and disrupting Republican meetings through actual and threatened violence. Beginning with the dispute of over free passage on a public road, the massacre was rooted in racial hatred and political motives. A court hearing attracted armed white rifle clubs, also known as the Red Shirts, who might later merge into the Triple Ks. Desiring to regain control of state governments and eradicate the civil rights of black Americans, over 100 white men attacked about 30 black servicemen of the National Guard at the Armory, killing 2 as they tried to leave that night. Later that night, the Red Shirts tormented and killed 4 of the militia while holding them as prisoners and wounded several others. In total, the events in Hamburg resulted in the death of 1 white man and 6 black men, with several more black individuals being wounded. Although 94 white men were indicted for the killings of the coronary jury, none were prosecuted. Number 6, Charleston. Yes, when it comes to violence against minorities and people of color, the US seems to be pretty adamant with that. In tying into more recent historical events, as this is also part of history, reflecting on number 7 is in number 6 with the unfortunate Charleston church shooting. Although this occurrence happened in 2015, the result of its hate crime was in a reflection of anti-blackness which took place in Charleston, South Carolina. 9 people were killed and the 10th was injured. The crime took place during the Bible study at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, one of the oldest black churches in the southern United States. Among the fatalities was the senior pastor, state senator, and at the time was noted as the deadliest mass violence that took place at a place of worship in the US history. Dylan Roof, who was the guilty party as he was 21 years old at the time, committing said crime, with images of him holding racist propaganda and posting a manifesto of his ambitions. After he was arrested, he later confessed that he committed the violence in hopes of igniting a race war, as well as according to his roommate, Roof expressed his support for racial segregation in the United States and he wanted to start a civil war. Okay. On December 15th, 2016, Roof was convicted in federal court of all 33 federal charges and is currently awaiting the death penalty.
Time to go back in time to witch trials, specifically witch trial cakes. Sadly, these aren't yummy Halloween cakes, but instead a bizarre form of counter magic, quote unquote, a supernatural dessert that was used to identify suspected evildoers. In cases of mysterious illness or possession, witch hunters would take a sample of the victim's urine, mix it with rye meal and ashes, and bake it into a cake. Now, this stomach-turning concoction was then fed to a familiar or animal helper of the suspected witch because they wanted to pray that the creature would fall under its spell, reveal the name of the guilty sorcerer. During the hysteria that preceded the Salem witch trials, Tituba famously helped prepare a witch cake to identify the person responsible for bewitching somebody. The brew failed to work, and the knowledge of spells and folk remedies that Tituba had was later used as evidence against her because they were like, you've got to be a witch for knowing this. One more thing, another use for a witch cake came from burning the pastry in hopes that the scorching heat would transfer to the witch and force her to reveal herself. But at the end of all of this, the harm against animals That's punishment enough and awful. Ever heard about a ducking chair? Not to be confused with a cucking chair, which is a whole other concept, or the red hot stools women accused of having naughty acts with the devil would have to sit on. Whole thing. Sadly, not enough information is out there to unpack all of that, but let's keep moving. The ducking stool was a strongly made wooden armchair, often made out of oak, in which the offender was seated, with an iron band being placed around them so they would not fall out during their immersion. The earliest record of the use of such is towards the beginning of the 17th century, and it was used in Europe, but also in the United States, and it was quite something. So usually this chair would be fastened to a long wooded beam, kind of like a seesaw, at the edge of a pond or a river. I'm sure you can see where this is going. Sometimes the ducking stool was not a fixture, but instead was mounted on a pair of wooden wheels, so that it could be wheeled through the streets. And at the river edge, it was just hanging by a chain. In sentencing a woman, the magistrates would order the number of duckings she should have. And as much as I've scoured the internet, there's some data missing on the numbers. The type of ducking stool was called a tumbrel, and this was a chair on two wheels with two long shafts fixed to the axles. This would be pushed into a pond, and then the shafts would be released, ergo tipping the chair up backwards. Sometimes this punishment proved fatal, and subjects would die. Once again, the sometimes should be taken with a pound of salt. Way back when, ducking was used as a way to establish whether somebody was a witch or not. So the ducking stools were used for this purpose, but then later you could do this without the chair. So in that instance, you would bind the subject's right thumb to your left big toe, and then you tie a rope around the waist of the accused and throw them into a pond. If you float, then you're in league with the devil. You're rejecting the baptismal water. And if you sink, you're clear. Oh, and you're also dead. We all know about gas chambers. They're an apparatus for killing humans or other animals with gas, consisting of a sealed chamber where you've got the poisonous or asphyxiant gas, and a lot of different gases can be used: hydrogen cyanide, carbon monoxide, and so forth and so on. So while this is more so associated with deaths in Germany during a certain time period, it's actually been used as a form of end-of-life torment in the States. And it's still legal in places like Arizona, Missouri, and Wyoming. The last person to meet their end by it was Walter LeGrand in Arizona in 1999, but it could technically still be used today if requested. Going back in history, there were some awful ways that a lot of Americans punished their own servants. Some accounts describe how different methods of punishment and harm became popular in the States, and William W. Brown discussed a common practice used in Virginia from an owner who had his property bound and lashed in the smokehouse. Then he created a fire from tobacco stems to suffocate and smoke the people as further punishment. Slaves are often expected to work in exceptionally difficult physical conditions, especially outside, and in theory, it would make sense for their bodies to be protected and maintained. Well, in cases where folks didn't meet what owners wanted them to meet, or they resisted, they would lose some body parts. Sometimes it involved cutting off an ear. Sometimes it would just be a slice of the flesh. More severe examples included amputation, gouging, sometimes even cutting hamstrings or castrating. In a lot of cases, folks wouldn't receive medical treatment, and that's the end of it for them. And finally, the upright jerker was an interesting twist on a classic end-of-life method. Rope necklacing, while it is a true standby, leaves much to be desired in terms of effectiveness. Depending on a lot of factors, it could be a very slow or awkward way to go. So how did folks get around this? Do it backwards. The upright jerker was a modified system that used heavy weights and pulleys to quickly jerk the condemned back into the air. Folks were hoping this would be more effective. Yeah, it didn't work.
Number 5, Know Nothing Riot. I know about nothing as much nothing knows about me, but somehow, some who may not know, the Know Nothing movement was a natives political movement in the United States in the mid-1850s. The national political organization, also known as the Know Nothing, was officially known as the Native American Party prior to 1855. Thereafter, it is simply known as the American Party, and members of the movement were required to say "I know nothing" whenever they were asked about specifics by outsiders, providing the group with its name. Mainly composed of Protestants, they had a huge resentment against Catholics and opened up what would be the Know Nothing riots, which apparently had a lot of riots throughout the years of 1844 to 1858. In the 5 months leading to the riots, nativist groups had been spreading false rumors that Catholics were trying to remove the Bible from public schools. Really, Catholics out of all people? Because of this rumor, it opened a chain reaction of violence against the Catholic community, especially the Irish Catholics that immigrated there. In relation to our number 10, Bloody Monday, it also was in association against the Irish as well as German immigrants who are also Catholic at the time. Number 4, the Greek Town Riot. Well, in US history, if you're an immigrant, you're bound to experience violence, especially in the past, but even now they'll do it at your face or even through small microaggressions that make you feel really small and confused. Another unknown crime committed in the US that not many might know about is the Greek Town Riot in Nebraska on February 21st, 1909. Several Greeks were wounded and injured when a mob of 3,000 men displaced some of the population of Greektown. They also wrecked buildings there and of course started a riot. They looted homes and businesses while physically harming Greeks as well as Italians and Romanians, who they misidentified as Greeks. According to some sources, a 14-year-old Greek boy was killed, although other sources stated that nobody was killed. The entire Greek population of South Omaha was warned to leave the city within 1 day or risk the ongoing wrath of the mob. During the violence, the South Omaha police did not or could not control the mob, and they asked help from the police in Omaha, which was a separate city at the time, but the police there decided not to join in. Why did this all happen? Well, because a 36-year-old man named John Masurides was taking English lessons from a 17-year-old girl, and he was accused of advancing onto her. Eventually, after the riot, John was put on trial, where he was sentenced to death after his sentencing. He was also denied a fair trial and was charged for the second degree after he fired a weapon at a man who was trying to kill him for the accusation on the 17-year-old girl. Number 3. Rodney King. In some way, this crime may not be known, but if you're a local in Los Angeles and was around in 1991, you might definitely remember. 3 police officers were acquitted after the savage beatings of Rodney King, an African-American man. According to the reports, the chase began after King, who was intoxicated, was caught speeding on the freeway by a Californian highway patrol cruiser, but he refused to pull over. When the police brutality ensued, it captured the vile language and attacks on Rodney, and when the violence was captured by George Holliday, the footage sparked massive outrage, and even more so when subsequent riots were triggered by the acquittal of the officers involved. As a result of several days of rioting, more than 50 people were killed, more than 2,300 were injured, and thousands were arrested. About 1,100 buildings were damaged, and total property damage was about $1 billion, which makes it the riots of one of the most devastating civil disruptions in American history. However, the events brought to the forefront concerns about racism and police brutality with the LAPD, as well as police brutality as a whole. But it wouldn't be until 2020 when another incident of violence caused by the police on George Floyd sparked another outcry on the lack of justice caused by law enforcement. And so many others since then remained unnoticed, like Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, and so many more, all the names that will never be forgotten. Number 2. Tulsa. The Tulsa Race Massacre, also known as the Tulsa Race Riot or the Black Wall Street Massacre, was a 2-day-long white supremacist terrorist massacre that took place between May 31st and June 1st, 1921, when mobs of white residents, some of whom had been appointed as deputies and armed by city government officials, attacked black residents and destroyed homes and businesses of the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The event is considered one of the most worst incidents of racial violence in American history, and the attackers burned and destroyed more than 35 square blocks of the neighborhood at the time, one of the wealthiest black communities in the United States, also known as Black Wall Street. In Don't Let Them Bury My Story, Viola Fletcher, a 109-year-old woman, as the last survivor of the Tulsa Massacre, recalls the horrific night in 1921. Viola Fletcher can still vividly remember the smell of her thriving neighborhood burning. She was only 7 years old when the massacre happened, and states in her book, quote, "You know, I can still smell the smoke, the burning. I remember the bodies, all the black bodies in the street. The sound of the guns, they didn't stop, and I can still hear them. I haven't forgotten that. I can't forget that. You can't forget. It doesn't go away." End quote. Thankfully, with activists and historians giving Viola a platform to tell her story, her book, as I mentioned, Don't Let Them Bury My Story, allows her to speak on her experiences of brutality and malice of that time. But like in Childish Gambino, This Is America, the trial and hearing for the massacre delayed her ruling on the defendant's motions to dismiss the case. But either way, her story isn't dismissed, for the people will forever know the truth. Number 1. The Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears was an ethnic cleansing and forced displacement of approximately 60,000 people of the 5 civil tribes between 1830 and 1850 by the United States government. Process of cultural transformation of their traditional ways of life towards a white American way of life as proposed by George Washington and Henry Knox was gaining momentum, especially through the Cherokee and Choctaw. Although Jackson was not the sole or original architect of removal policy, his contributions were influential to its trajectory. Jackson's support of the removal of the Indians began as at least a decade before in his presidency. Indian removal was Jackson's top legislative priority upon taking office. After being elected president, he wrote in his first address to Congress, "The immigration should be voluntary, for it would be cruel as unjust to compel the Aborigines to abandon the graves of their fathers and seek a home in a distant land, as if any of it was voluntary." Even for some scholars, they labeled the displacement as genocidal acts, as historian Jeffrey Alsler argues that when genocide was not unequivocally carried out, the threat of genocide was used to ensure natives' compliances with removal policies, and concluded that, in quote, "in its outcome and the means of use to gain compliance, the policy had genocidal dimensions." Like the Nakba in 1948 and 2023 in Palestine, displacement of any indigenous people in general is a crime.
Laws around how bad punishment can be today are only in place because of how bad they were throughout history. Some of the things I can't talk about include waterboarding, the horrors of MK Ultra, witch trial doozies, and more. more. Question for y'all, what do you consider the worst punishment you could have received throughout history? Let me know in the comments and let's see if it makes today's list. Let's kick things off with a doozy of a punishment that's been used throughout American history, and that's none other than waterboarding. So this is a form of torment in which water is poured over a cloth covering the face and breathing passages of an immobilized captive, causing the person to experience a sensation of drowning. In the most common method of waterboarding, the captive's face is covered with a cloth or some other thin material, and then they're on their back at an incline of about 10 to 20 degrees, to be specific. Punishers pour water onto the face over the breathing passages, which causes an almost immediate gag reflex and that bad sensation I mentioned a moment ago. So normally water is poured intermittently to prevent death, but if it's poured without interruption, that's death by asphyxia. Not fun. Waterboarding can cause extreme pain, damage to the lungs, brain damage from oxygen deprivation, other physical injuries, possibly broken bones due to struggling against restraints, and overall just lasting psychological damage. Adverse physical effects can last for months, and psychological effects for the rest of your life. Another form of what is considered cruel and unusual punishment in the US of A happens to be sleep deprivation. Not the one you do to yourself. The United States Justice Department released 4 memos in August of 2002 describing interrogation techniques used by the CIA, and claimed that forced sleep deprivation for up to 180 hours, 7.5 days straight, by shackling a diapered prisoner to the ceiling. They were like, oh no, that's not torment. Also, apparently the combination of multiple interrogation methods, including this one, were like, nah. And I think a lot of folks would disagree. While it leaves no physical signs of harm, the United Nations does recognize it as a form of awfulness. Project MKUltra. Now this had the stated goal of developing biological and chemical weapons during the Cold War, but it also secretly dosed a lot of individuals with LSD. Why? They wanted to test the potential for mind control. The project began during a period of what journalist Rupert Cornwell described as paranoia at the CIA, when the US had lost its nuclear monopoly and fear of communism was at its height. Although the practice reportedly continued for 2 decades, it was launched before the big movement of the 60s that made LSD into a popular counterculture symbol. And, oh right, mind control. During the program, the CIA established front companies to work with more than 80 institutions, and in some cases, academic researchers were funded through grants from the CIA front organizations, but they didn't know that the CIA was using their work for these purposes. So, what did the agency do? Well, they ran experiments on subjects, humans, using LSD, hypnosis, and a lot of torment. Many of the human guinea pigs were mental patients, prisoners, addicts, or as one agency put it, people who couldn't fight back. And this wasn't just in the United States. In areas under American control, so Europe, East Asia, Japan, and so forth, the CIA created secret detention centers so the US could avoid criminal prosecution. The CIA captured people suspected of being enemy agents and people they deemed expendable so they could have some fun and learn. Prisoners were interrogated while being administered these fun substances, electroshocked, and subjected to extremes of temperature. Also dealing with sensory isolation, which, yikes. In one case in particular, a patient in Kentucky was dosed continuously for 174 days. So invested in all of this was the CIA that some have labeled the agency responsible for the entire psychedelic movement in the US. At least 2 American deaths can be attributed to this program, according to the Church Committee. And the Church Committee uncovered a lot of this, but at the end of the day, a lot of the top secret files were ordered to be destroyed in 1973 by the director after the Watergate scandal. But there's enough left to confirm one of the wildest and most crazy stories from the history books. And sure, while some folks might be looking at this like, woohoo, free acid. No, this was torment for a lot of people and absolutely awful and ruined their lives. So when most folks think of awful punishments, they often think of scars and wounds. However, inflictors of pain often use methods that are painful and create long-term injuries but without scars, which I know I've already talked about a bit today, but let's talk some more about it. So the use of stress positions is one of these awful methods, and it's pretty common. These positions force a prisoner into a painful physical position, such as forced standing, awkward sitting positions, or suspension of the body for prolonged periods of time. This can lead to long-term or even permanent damage, including nerve, joint, and circulatory damage and muscle and joint pain. And yep, it's another one of those things on the list of things used by the US government that they technically aren't supposed to do.
6. Tarring and feathering. Tarring and feathering was a form of public punishment, and of course, the feathers, you're quite humiliated when this happens. The offender was stripped, covered in hot tar, and then rolled in feathers. They look like a chicken, I guess. I don't know what the whole point was for this. The punishment often targeted tax collectors and other unpopular figures during periods of unrest. Tax collectors, they're like, yeah, go bathe in the tar. This is crazy. Who did this? The first recorded use in America was 1766 against British customs officer John Malcolm in Boston. He was the first. God, that would suck to be the first to get tarred and feathered. Oh my God. Imagine hearing that. I'd be like, what? You're making this up. It continued sporadically through the 19th century, with one of the last known instances occurring during the early 1900s. It didn't last long. The practice eventually fell out of use as legal systems evolved and more humane methods were adopted. In other words, we said, you know what, that's a bit much, isn't it? That's probably a bit much. We should just do something else. Number 5, the electric chair. This next one here is quite shocking. The electric chair was introduced in the late 19th century as a little bit more humane alternative to hanging. It was first used in America on August 6, 1890 to punish William Kemmler in New York. Now, the method aimed to provide a quicker and less painful death. However, it has faced criticisms for its potential for causing severe pain and not being that quick. The last use of the electric chair in the US occurred on January 16, 2013, quite recent. This was after Robert Gleason Jr. was killed in Virginia via electric chair. It's horrible. I used to see it in movies growing up and I thought it was like a fake thing that maybe was in Saw movies, but no, this is how people would die. Just horrible. Number 4. Branding. Branding involved marking a criminal's skin with a hot iron to permanently indicate their crime, often on the hand or forehead. Big differences, like here or your forehead? Are you kidding me? Can you do anywhere else but my forehead? This form of punishment dates back to ancient times and was used, of course, as a deterrent and a means of public shaming, as are all of these. In America, branding was first used in the early colonial period, using the method for crimes like theft and blasphemy. One of the last recorded instances of branding in the United States was in the early 19th century, and societal views on the punishment eventually, thankfully, evolved, and such methods were replaced by incarceration and other normal, if you want to say that, normal forms of reform. Imagine being the last guy being branded. What? You're so close. Psst, and we're done. No more. Sorry, so close. Number 3. Exile and banishment. The punishment of go away. Just keep going forever. Bye. This one involved forcing offenders to leave a community or a region entirely. Just get on out of here. These were common punitive measures in early colonial America. Quite a popular place to start these punishments. These punishments were used to remove undesirable individuals, such as criminals or those accused of witchcraft, from society. Yeah, you're either a thief or a magician. See you later. We don't take either of those. The practice was rooted in English common law and aimed to protect the community while punishing the offender in a more chill way. One of the last notable instances of exile in America was the banishment of Mary Dyer from the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1659 for her Quaker beliefs. Now, as the legal system evolved, exile and banishment were largely replaced by imprisonment and fines, but I don't know, I'd rather just be sent off away. That sounds way easier. You know what? Go start fresh. Just don't do it again over there. Bye. What? All right, easy. Number 2, pamphlet punishment. This one is very recent and it's so bizarre I had to include it in today's list. In May 2011, an Ohio couple, Grace Nash and Bruce Crawford, they both ignored flood emergency warnings and stole an unregistered raft. They then made their way to the Grand River for a hazardous swim. This was reported by CBS News, and if the headlines weren't bizarre enough here, wait until you hear their punishment. When they made it to land, they allegedly misled officials about the details of this misadventure, but eventually the couple came clean and they admitted to the whole thing, and they got a 90-day sentence in jail. Now here's the kicker. 30 days were knocked off immediately, and Ohio Judge Michael C. Kennedy gave them an option to knock off the rest of their time by standing in a children's pool, wearing life jackets, and handing out water safety pamphlets during a food festival. They would stand in a pool and hand out pamphlets all day. That sounds like a great time. I don't know. Sounds like they got off easy. A food festival in May, that sounds like the best place to hang out all day. Don't ignore flood warnings or you'll be embarrassed for like 8 hours. Okay. Number 1, the iron gag. Not to be confused with the Iron Giant, the iron gag was a metal device used to silence prisoners by clamping their tongues down. Yeah, kinda hard to beg for your life when you can't talk. You have a big piece of metal in your mouth. You have the Iron Giant's finger down your throat. This horrible device was famously used in the Matthias Macumsey case from Lancaster County in 1833. See, Matthias got himself busted for manslaughter and was given the iron gag while serving time in the Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. This case is well known because Matthias died in prison while wearing one of these. Yeah, imagine that. Your last moments and your tongue is clamped down. That's like a saw trap. That's one of the worst ways to go. History is brutal.
Over 200,000 people, or about 1 in 7 prisoners in the United States, are serving life or virtual life sentences in 2019. And over 50,000 prisoners are serving life without a chance of parole, and in many cases from current to distant past, so many were locked up for a variety of crime. Although Arthur Barker was sentenced to serve a life sentence, it didn't last that long as much as we thought. Arthur Raymond Doc Barker was an American criminal, the son of Ma Barker and a member of Barker Karpus gang founded by his brother Fred Barker and Alvin Karpus. Barker was typically called on for violent actions while Fred and Karpus planned the gang crimes. He was arrested and convicted of kidnapping in 1935 and sent to Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary in 1936 as he was killed 3 years later while attempting to escape. Barker was described as one writer, a dimwit and a drunk, who was not much more than a brutal thug. However, fellow Alcatraz inmate Henry Young said that he was determined and ruthless and that once he started on anything, nothing could stop him but death. On August 25, 1921, Barker and 3 other men robbed a woman at a hospital construction site in Tulsa. The 3 men were surprised by the night watchman, Thomas Sherrill. Sherrill was fatally shot when 2 of the men shot at him while fleeing the scene. After Sherrill's family hired a private investigator, Barker and another man, Volney Curley Davis, who worked at the construction site and was friendly with the Barker family, were arrested for Sherrill's death. When he was sent to Alcatraz, and him and his other inmates tried to escape the rough, watery terrain by creating a moat, but unfortunately they were caught on the island. As a result, the guard shot him even though he had died during the recapture. Raymond Kwok Chung Chow was also named Shrimp Boy, is a Hong Kong-born felon with ties to the San Francisco Chinatown Street Gang and an organized crime syndicate, including an American branch of the Hong Kong-based triad Wo Hop To and Hop Sing Boys. In 2014, Chow, with 28 other defendants including former California State Senator Leland Yee, was also indicted for racketeering, money laundering, and a host of other alleged criminal activities. Leland Yee pleaded guilty to racketeering in 2015 in July for conspiring with his campaign fundraiser to defeat donation limits through the money laundering aspect. Despite initial press release, Chow was not indicted in any form of racketeering conspiracy with Leland Yee, as Chow was indicted in a racketeering conspiracy which alleged that he oversaw the criminal factions of the Geet Kong Tong. On January 8, 2016, Chow was then found guilty on all 162 charges, including 1 count of death. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole plus 20 years, and Chow wrote an autobiography entitled Shrimp Boy, A Life of Crime, Violence, and Redemption Inside the Chinatown Underworld, 2013. Albert Henry DeSalvo was an American killer, vile offender, and a suspected serial killer in Boston who was also known and confessed to being the Boston Strangler. And in 1967, DeSalvo was imprisoned for life for committing a series of harm. However, this killing confession that he had made had disputed, and debate continues to which crimes he actually committed. In July 2013, DNA was matched between a fluid found from Mary Sullivan, a victim of Albert, and DNA obtained from DeSalvo's nephew, linking DeSalvo to the killings of Sullivan and excluding 99.9% of the remaining population. Authorities exhumed DeSalvo's remains later after the month and confirmed the DNA match. Although many crimes he's committed, including breaking and entering, was noted, as well as the deaths he was sentenced to lie in prison in 1967. In February of that year, he escaped with 2 fellow inmates from Bridgewater State Hospital, triggering a full-scale manhunt. A note was found on his bunk addressed to the superintendent. In it, DeSalvo stated that he escaped to focus attention on the conditions in the hospital and his own situation. 3 days after the escape, he called his lawyer to turn himself in. His lawyer then sent the police to rearrest him in Lynn, Massachusetts. Following the escape, he was transferred to a maximum security prison known at the time as Walpole, where he later recanted the rest of his crimes, and on November 25, 1973, he was found stabbed to death in the prison infirmary. Robert Wilson, who was associated with the Winter Hill Gang, was tried for DeSalvo's killings, but at the end of the trial, it was a hung jury. Paul Bergeron is an American convicted felon and former criminal defense lawyer who practiced law in Newark, New Jersey. Prior to his conviction, he was known for defending a large range of famous and notorious clients, and he was convicted for conspiracy to killing a witness and other racketeering, illegal puffs, and adult working offenses. The sentences include 6 concurrent life terms in federal prison in 2013, and he was disbarred by the Supreme Court of New Jersey in 2016. A veteran lawyer from the area said the crimes alleged in the federal indictment would make Bergeron the craziest, most evil lawyer in history of New Jersey. Jersey. And quote-unquote, that is saying something. And a federal court had likened Berggren's downfall to the plot of a drama, as on March 18, 2013, a jury convicted attorney Berggren of all 23 counts of which he was tried, including conspiracy to killing a witness and other racketeering and all that other nasty stuff. The U.S. Attorney for New Jersey, Paul J. Fishman, announced to the verdict Berggren's conduct was stunning violation of his role as an officer of the court and a betrayal to his roots as a member of law enforcement, said U.S. Attorney Fishman. He also quoted that the jury returned the verdict compelled by the evidence and opposed the justice that he had served, as they take no joy of his tragic fall. Berggren received a life sentence on September 23, 2013. Julianne Busek is an American writer, activist, and widow of the co-conspirator Zvonko Busek, as she was arrested with Busek in 1976 after hijacking TWA Flight 355 and sentenced to life in prison with early parole. She married Zvonko Busek in 1972, and they lived together in Austria, Germany, and Ohio before moving to New York City. They were active in publicizing human rights violations in former Yugoslavia and in promoting the cause of the Croatian independence. On September 10, 1976, she and her husband and 3 others hijacked domestic Trans World Airlines flights 355 with the threat of an explosion. While refueling the hijacked plane at Montreal's Mirabel International Airport, officials say that they planted this explosion at a locker at the Grand Central Terminal and gave instructions on finding it. They wanted the news to be out and open and have the American people concerned about Croatia's independence be printed all over the media. But during the hijacking, when the device was found at the Grand Central Terminal, they actually realized after they were being flown over to London that the group ended up surrendering. And turns out that little weapon they had was just a kitchen pressure cooker, so you could say that they were under pressure. Ernest Burkhart was an American killer who participated in the Osage Indian deaths as a hitman for his uncle William King Hale's crime ring. He was convicted for the killing of William E. Smith in 1926 and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Burkhart was paroled in 1937 but was actually sent back to prison for burglarizing his former sister-in-law's house in 1940. After being paroled, Burkhart was pardoned by Oklahoma's Governor Henry Bellman in 1965 or around 1966 for his role in the Osage's death. Hale and his nephews Ernest and Byron Burkhart conspired to kill several Osage people for their head rights after Ernest married Molly Kyle, an Osage herself. Victims of Ernest included her sister's husband, housekeeper, and her cousin, and eventually she also experienced symptoms of poisoning and realized that he was also trying to get rid of her. So she moved away, divorced him, and her children inherited her estate. A warrant for Hale and Ernest's arrest was issued in January 4th, 1926, but for the killings of Bill and Retta Smith. Ernest was apparently apprehended immediately, but Hale could not be found. According to David Gran, Hale later turned himself in wearing a perfectly dressed suit, shoes shined to the gleam, a felt hat, and an overcoat with his diamond-studded Masonic lodge pin fastened to his lapel. Hale maintained his innocence, so federal agents focused on interrogating Ernest, and Burkhart was sent to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister after being found guilty on June 21st, 1926.